Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We're going to be diving into an ever important topic when it comes to making sure our cows are having the best life possible, and that is ventilation. It also is one of those topics that you might think, gosh, my barn is just fine. But when you really think about it in nitty-gritty terms, it might be something that you want to look at or maybe invest more time into. And joining us this afternoon to have this discussion is Courtney Hallbach, who is an outreach specialist with the Dairyland Initiative. So we're excited to have her on. And momentarily, we will get to all the good stuff you are waiting here for. But I do have to thank at the top of the hour here our current support for the Dairy Signal, which is Zinpro. And for over 50 years, they have been the leader in research and development of performance trace minerals. Zinpro believes your herd's profitability depends on providing the right nutrition at the right time. And you can discover their industry leading tools and solutions at their website at zimpro.com. So, a huge thank you to them as we get underway here this afternoon for their support of the Dairy Signal. But with all of that, Courtney, it has been a minute since we've had you on. How are you doing? And would you mind giving a brief introduction about yourself for those who might be meeting you for the first time?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Amber, for the invite to be a part of the PDP Dairy Signal again. I think the last time I was on here was about a year ago. And to answer your question about how you're doing, well, to be honest, I was really looking forward to a white Christmas and cross-country skiing a little bit, but the rain today in Madison is really putting a damper on those dreams. I don't know if that's going to happen, but who knows? Fingers crossed, we might have a Christmas miracle and have some snow before the 25th. But for those of you who are not familiar with the Dairyland Initiative, it's an outreach program at the School of Veterinary Medicine that is focused on providing dairy farmers with the latest information about dairy barn design and ventilation so that we can promote cow health and productivity in a sustainable way. And as my role with the Dairyland as the outreach specialist, I'm helping farmers who are looking at either building new facilities or retrofitting existing ones so that they can optimize their cow comfort. And I'm excited to talk about ventilation and specifically talk about positive pressure ventilation in terms of its role in making the cow barn environment ideal today on the Dairy Signal.
Well, we're excited to have you back here and to really dive into this because it is one of those areas where it's getting some discussion around it and with good reason. And maybe I'm jumping the gun here a little bit, and maybe you're going to get into this. But before we dive in and really just trying to hook those who are or maybe joining us early on here, but why does this discussion around ventilation matter? I mean, before we dive into your slides, I think setting that stage of why is this important is always a good question to ask right off the bat here.
Oh yeah. I mean, the role of air quality is huge in how we optimize cow health. I mean, just, I hate to bring up the pandemic again, but remember when people were coming out and saying how drafty buildings were actually better for people because of all of the fresh air that was coming in versus some of our latest and greatest buildings that are tightly sealed and keeping air in. It's really important to help get those noxious gases, bacteria, humidity out of the barn so that cows are breathing in fresh air and reducing their risk of respiratory illness. And then on the flip side of just not ventilating the barn for improved air quality, but looking at providing that air movement and thinking about how we can create fast moving air in the cow's resting space to help keep her cool as our summers are getting longer and hotter is helpful in maintaining lawing times, which results in improved and maintained milk production and body temperature. So, whenever I'm talking about ventilating barns, I'm not just talking about ventilating the overall space, but also thinking about the cow microenvironment and how we can make sure she's comfortable during periods of heat stress.
Well, I think that is a perfect way to set up today's discussion. And I want to remind folks that if you're watching live, you can actually ask your questions and interact with Courtney here. And to do so is really simple. You just have to go to that bottom right-hand corner of your video screen, and you'll see three little dots. Click on that, and there'll be a prompt where it'll say ask a question. Fill in that information. If you don't want to put your name, that's just fine. You can put space or NA or whatever. But from there, you are able to fill out a question, and we'll go from there. But with all of that being said, and without further ado, Courtney, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started for all of the information that we're excited here for today.
Well, thank you, Amber. So I always like to provide the definition of what ventilation is whenever I am giving talks about ventilation, because I find that there is some misconception over what it is. You see a fan put up and you go, oh, well, it's ventilating. And I want you to question whether it is providing fresh air into a building space, because that is true ventilation versus just hanging up a fan and recirculating air. That's only providing air movement. So for us to ventilate a barn, we are bringing air in through open sidewalls or designed inlets, and then moving that air out through passive exits with perhaps an open ridge in the roof or exhaust fans pulling that air out. And that helps take away all those negative things that build up in the barn, such as heat, moisture, noxious gases, and airborne pathogens. And so a lot of times, a lot of people know about ammonia and think, okay, if we have really high rates of ammonia, then the barn isn't ventilated well, which is very much can be the case. I mean, my rule of thumb in regards to ammonia levels is if you can smell it, then it's probably too high. So, especially the case in our calf environments, you can really smell ammonia there. Maybe not so much in our adult cow facilities, just because we have better ways of removing urine out of the facility. But there are some invisible gases as well that we're concerned about, such as carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and carbon monoxide. These are all things that aren't necessarily something that you can smell. You may have bodily issues such as headaches, feeling faint, maybe feel like vomiting, things like that, that will indicate that there is a buildup of noxious gases, but really that's not something that I've seen as something very prevalent here in our dairies because they are so well ventilated. But it's really important that we are getting that air exchange to make sure that we are reducing the buildup of gases. And so when it comes to looking at barn ventilation and what the key criteria are, no matter if it's a naturally ventilated barn or a mechanically ventilated barn, my first and foremost goal is always to make sure that the barn is designed to provide a minimum ventilation rate of 4 to 8 air changes in the winter. And this is for the overall barn volume. And then on the high end in the summer, when we want to try and get as much air turnover as possible, we're going to be looking at 40 to 60 air changes per hour in the summer. And when I say summer, I'm saying at a THI of 68, which could be, depending on what the humidity is at the time, that could be a temperature of, 66 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, you never know. And then in the winter, it is, looking at that freezing cutoff. So those rates below 32 degrees. So even when we are in the negative digits, it is still super important to provide that minimum ventilation rate of at least 4 air changes per hour. And then ramping it up from winter to summer in the spring and fall. And, based on whatever the temperature is, what the moisture climate is like, then trying to get an increased air exchange rate. So target about 20 air changes an hour in the fall/spring, which we can do either by opening up the curtains in a naturally ventilated barn or um, having staged fans in our mechanical ventilation system. So that's always number one. It's always make sure that we have sufficient air exchange rate. And then number two is making sure that the system works well across all these seasons, because it's really easy to design a system that works really well in the summer, possibly more so on the mechanical side. And then when it comes down to the winter, all of a sudden we have a really hard time distributing air and getting moisture out of the barn. And then on the flip side, in our naturally ventilated barns, it might be easier to ventilate in the winter or at, fall, spring. But then when it comes to summer and we are relying on the prevailing winds, it's not so great. So trying to balance that ventilation and heat abatement throughout the year. And then once we do that with the overall ventilation design of the barn, focusing on creating fast moving air in the cow microenvironment, because she is going to spend hopefully 12 hours a day lying down in the stall. And we want to make sure that, the air quality and the air speeds where she is resting is just as good as it would be if she was standing at the feed bunk. And then, of course, we're always concerned about costs. And so making sure that the ventilation plan is cost effective for the herd in terms of installation costs, operating costs, and maintenance costs. So one point I wanted to make is that, air isn't evenly distributed throughout the barn. It likes to take the path of least resistance. So, our open feed alleys down the center of barns, the, stall alleys, great places for air to move. But it's not going to want to go where there's all these obstacles, meaning cows lying in stalls. So when mechanical ventilation systems were starting to be built, there was a lot of focus on how do we get that air exchange through the volume of the barn, but not too much focus on that cow micro environment or the stall micro environment. And so now that's secondhand in ventilation designs. People are very conscious of that, trying to find ways to create that fast moving air in the stall, either with fans over the stalls or strategically placed baffles to create air speeds of 200 to 400 feet per minute at cow resting height. And so, again, bottom line, it's air isn't evenly distributed in a barn, and we not only focus on the overall barn ventilation, but also what the cow is experiencing in her microenvironment. And why is that important? Well, in the summer, cows need to cool off by standing up and having more surface area to help dissipate heat. And so when Ian Atkins with Dr. Chris Choi here at UW-Madison in Biological Systems Engineering was looking at heat abatement in dairy cows, he looked at, how the respiration rate, the body temperature, increased or decreased when the cow was either lying or standing. So if you're somebody that's tuning in and watching the dairy signal, there's a nice little graph on the screen where the orange lines indicate when the cow is standing up. So at the top of the diagram, that shows when she's standing up. And then when the orange lines are down on the bottom, that indicates that she is lying down. And what I really want you to take away from this diagram is that when the cow is lying down, her body temperature goes up, and then she stands, it decreases before she lies down again, and it goes back up. And she actually gains body temperature faster lying down than standing up. So that's why during periods of heat stress, we see cows' lying times decrease often, sometimes significantly, just because she is trying to cool herself down. And so, within the last few years now, there's been some research done focusing on how we can maintain lying times and make sure that she has longer lying bouts and less standing bouts by providing fast moving air in the cow resting space. And so that, again, how do we keep cows lying down? And that's with what we call the minimum cooling airspeed, and we named it MCAS. And then unfortunately, the software in the Boeing planes that was making them fail is also called MCAS, but we're sticking to it. We're going to keep MCAS, minimum cooling airspeed, which is that 200 to 400 feet per minute at about 1.5 feet or cow resting height. There's, some people ask, is it worthwhile to go beyond that and, let's say, perhaps provide more than 400, 500 feet per minute? And when we were doing this research here in Wisconsin, we didn't see any benefits at going above that threshold. You're paying more and not seeing the bang for your buck for running those fans at those higher air speeds. And so here in Wisconsin, stick to that 200 to 400 feet per minute. However, if you are tuning in from, let's say, Florida or Georgia, it might be worthwhile to err on the side of the top end there and target more closer to that 400 feet per minute than the 200 feet per minute here in Wisconsin. So, of course, your climate does play a role in some of these recommendations, but for sure the minimum, which has been defined in the field of 200 feet per minute or 2.25 miles per hour, is the minimum airspeed that you need to cool cows. And then another side point is just, I've been in some barns that provide really, really fast moving air. It was easily over, it was about 800 feet per minute, I think. And they were bedding with manure solids. And it was very difficult just being in the facility because the bedding was being picked up by the fast moving air. So there is also some detriment to having too fast of air speeds with bedding being picked up as well. So that brings me to what are the ventilation systems that are out there. Our most common is natural ventilation. The majority of our dairies are naturally ventilated, meaning that they have open side walls with curtains. They have eaves along both sides of the sidewall that are open 1 inch for every 10 feet of building width, and then an open ridge down the center of the barn that is open 2 inches for every 10 feet of building width, so that as air is moving over a 1 in 4 roof pitch, it sucks air out of the open ridge. So you have that air coming in through the curtain sidewalls and being sucked out through the ridge. What's key in making a naturally ventilated barn work is to make sure that the sidewalls are nice and high so we can capture the prevailing winds, but then also make sure that we're not blocking the winds from getting into the barn. So I like to make sure that we have at least 100 feet between other buildings, tree lines, cornfields, equipment, anything that could be blocking that natural airflow into the barn. And then naturally ventilated barns will have fans over the stalls to help create that fast moving airspeed. Now, because the prevailing winds aren't always consistent, we might have issues with where we can position the barn on the farmstead. So typically here in Wisconsin, we like to orient naturally ventilated barns east to west so that we can capture our prevailing winds from the south-southwest and also limit sunlight from entering into the barn. But so yeah, we might have limitations to where we can locate the facilities. We don't have consistent prevailing winds. And like I said, our summers are getting longer and hotter. So because our electricity is fairly cheap here in the United States, we have turned towards looking at mechanically ventilating barns. And there's many different ways to mechanically ventilate a barn. There's positive pressure, which is gonna be the main focus of the top today. But that is where you're relying on fans to force air into the barn, and then that air exits through an open ridge passively. Then there's negative pressure, which is the most common type of mechanical ventilation. The ones that you might be familiar with, Amber, would be a tunnel ventilated barn or a cross ventilated barn, where tunnels and cross both have a controlled inlet, typically a curtain, and then opposite the inlet is exhaust fans. And where the inlet and exhaust fans are located will make it a tunnel or a cross. So tunnel ventilated barns will pull air along the length of the barn or parallel to the center feed alley, and then cross is where you are drawing air across the width of the facility perpendicular to the center feed lane. And so again, there's really no pro for tunnel versus cross. It depends on how you want to lay out your facility, what your preference is for maintaining fans, and so on. So that's really a case-by-case basis. And then there are some neutral pressure barns. I've seen a couple adult cow facilities that you would say are neutral pressure, but more so in heifer facilities where you have fans forcing air in and exhausting air out. So it's very heavily mechanical with that dual purpose of using fans of bringing air in and out.
So, Courtney, before we move on from this slide, actually, I know you mentioned that natural pressure is, or natural, not natural pressure, excuse me, that naturally ventilated barns typically are the most common, at least here in the Midwest, Wisconsin specifically. But when it comes to positive, negative, neutral, kind of where do they fall? Which one, is there one that tends to lead the pack the most? they all have their pros and cons. It all depends on, what the goals of that specific barn are, how they're laid out, and everything in between. But when trying to think about it, in terms of have I seen one of these barns with talking positive pressure, where does that fall?
Negative pressure for sure is all the rage. So those tunnel and cross ventilated facilities, a lot of the new facilities are considering cross or tunnel right away, just because a lot of people are fed up with the unpredictability of their natural ventilation or cows bunching. Cows equate light to heat, and even in naturally ventilated barns that have darkened shades, people might close up the end doors, they've put fans over the stalls, sand bedding. It's a great environment, and yet cows bunch in the dead of summer, and it just drives everyone nuts. And so these cross and tunnel ventilated barns virtually reduce and eliminate bunching behaviors. So, and again, because electricity is not that much here, and it's really pennies in certain parts of the state, it's a real easy choice, economical choice to go with negative pressure. The positive pressure has just entered the realm of ventilating barns within the last several years, and it's very specific to the type of barn. So I'll talk about that, but it's not as popular just because it requires a certain type of barn. And then neutral pressure, it hasn't really taken off with the adult cows, but there's a handful of heifer facilities where people just want that control with their system. So negative pressure for sure is number one. Neutral and positive are kind of on par with each other in terms of their popularity.
Well, thank you for going through that. I know we're going to talk about positive pressure specifically here today. But I'm excited to go through that because it is an area where, like you said, it's newer in the discussion in the realm of, is this the right fit for the barn that we have or the barn that we're building? So I'll let you keep going here.
All right. So that leads us to these positive pressure barns and what makes them so unique. So the idea behind these systems is that it's a hybrid system. It naturally ventilates in the winter and then switches over to mechanical and relies on positive pressure in the summer. So these positive pressure barns have curtain sidewalls, no different, than your naturally ventilated barn. The only difference is that at the top of the curtain sidewalls, there are fans placed evenly along the length of the sidewall, blowing air into the pen. And so once temperatures reach about 68 degrees, the curtains are going to close and then the fans are going to turn on. And that's going to provide both ventilation and heat abatement. And the area between the fans along the sidewall is closed up so that there isn't recirculation of air. We are only bringing in fresh outside air into the barn. And then you still maintain an open ridge. So one of the key things in a naturally ventilated barn is having an open ridge so that that air can exhaust out of the facility. And so we maintain that open ridge. And once we switch over to the positive pressure system, that ridge is still open, and that's how air is going to exit out of the barn. This fits well with barns that are either newly built or retrofitted. This one is actually connected to another naturally ventilated barn. So where I'm taking the picture from behind me is a naturally ventilated facility. They just added on and switch this over to positive pressure. So it's nice in that it works with existing naturally ventilated facilities. But what's key here is that it lends itself very well to 4-row barns. So 2 pens of head-to-head stalls. There's meaning that the outside of the pen is an alleyway. There are no row of outside stalls along the side wall. And the reason for this is because you want to target that fast moving air into the cow resting space. And if we had a row of stalls immediately underneath the fans, they'd completely miss out on that fast moving airspeed. So that's why if you're looking at retrofitting an existing facility and possibly looking at adding positive pressure tube or positive pressure fans, it really only lends itself well to these 2-row head-to-head pens. One of the downsides to this is that there is some ability of these fans to bring in rain from the outside. So making sure that you've got some protection from the elements or being aware of when there is a driving rain on one side of the barn, you may want to turn them off for a little bit so that we're not blowing water into the stall beds. But typically these fans are installed on a 14-foot high sidewall, angled down so that we are hitting that head-to-head row of pens. And the first installation put in 36-inch fans, and those were spaced at 10 feet apart. Some of the newer facilities are going with larger fans, and still kind of spacing them 10 to 20 feet apart, but just, making sure that we have even distribution of fans along the entire sidewall on both sides of the facility. And so, again, these systems turn on, they switch from a winter ventilation or natural ventilation in the winter to positive pressure in the summer at about a THI of 68. And together, these fans should provide anywhere from 40 to 60 air changes per hour. So getting back to our design criteria for any barn ventilation system, prioritizing getting sufficient air exchange, and then making sure that we are getting fast moving air in the stalls. There's a bit of a higher installation cost just because we are adding curtains to both sides of the barn yet. Plus, there's some custom housing involved with installing these fans. So lots of upfront installation costs, but once that is done, the operating costs are fairly minimal. There is a bit of fan maintenance. So imagine having a fan every 10 feet in your facility. So it's something that you definitely need to prioritize, just because you will lose fan efficiency of at least 15 to 20% if you aren't maintaining fans properly and making sure there isn't dust buildup on the motor and blades. So you definitely have to be someone that is willing to get up there and clean. And with these newer barns, just because there is such a buildup of static pressure inside of the facility, these newer builds are accommodating that by having a larger ridge, so about a 4.5-foot wide open ridge, just so that we can handle the increase in static pressure inside of the barn. And then for herds that maybe shipping milk and have standards or have to meet a requirement for allowing cows to have outside access, this type of ventilation system is nice in that cows can still go outside. And so you can have a, open door allowing outside access, and that's not going to mess with the ventilation system. Whereas with a mechanical or a negative pressure system where you need those controlled inlets and outlets, you're not going to have an open door outside. So there's some nice flexibility here with these hot positive pressure hybrid facilities. In terms of costs, we've created the Dairyland Initiative has created a adult cow ventilation spreadsheet where we can estimate the cost of operating the system, installing the system, and compare that to what the potential loss would be because of heat stress on cows. And so the formula that we use is pretty basic. It's, assuming less milk production. If cow gets heat stress, that she'll produce less milk, but it doesn't take into all of the detriments of heat stress, such as reproduction losses and lameness incidents increasing. But in general, with Madison, Wisconsin, where we have 77 days above 68 degrees, and we value every single one of those. The estimated loss per cow per year, if we did nothing to prevent heat stress, would be about $138. And so when looking at a ventilation system, we compare the annual operating cost to that potential loss per cow per year. And if the operation cost of running the ventilation system is less than that anticipated marginal milk loss per cow, then it's a no-brainer. We should look at installing that ventilation system. And so we can do that for various locations. And one of my colleagues in biological systems engineering here compiled some data about what the heat stress days were here in Madison. And, the majority of our days come in the middle of July and August. Those are our summer heat stress months. And we're right around that kind of mild to moderate heat stress levels where we might see a slight or noticeable drop in milk production. Within the last 5 years, we haven't hit those severe heat stress levels here in Madison. So we're really focused on, combating mild to moderate heat stress and doing that by implementing improved ventilation systems, focusing on providing that fast moving air, and then using water as well to cool our animals. And so getting back to the costs of these ventilation systems and how much they're running for wherever location we are located, we went out and did a mock design for the 6 main types of ventilation systems that are out there for an 800 cow herd. And what we found is that the positive pressure hybrid barn has the most fans. So again, it had about 203 fans versus a naturally ventilated barn that only had 68, or a cross ventilated facility or tunnel with fans over the stalls that are 124. So, basically doubling the amount of fans as some of the other mechanical ventilation system. And so that really means a lot of upfront costs for installation and then maintenance costs as well. But in terms of operating the system, it actually was our second cheapest option. For a naturally ventilated barn, uh, the estimated operating cost for this 800 cow herd was $28 per cow per year versus the positive pressure hybrid, which was about $46. So a little bit more expensive, but not nearly as expensive as the negative pressure systems, the crosser tunnel, which ranged from 64 to $84 per cow per year. And so we did that for Madison, and then somewhere extreme with a lot of heat stress like Jacksonville, Florida. And really the difference there is just how many more days you are operating. So if you are someone that's down in southeastern United States, these numbers are basically double that than what we're seeing in Madison, because it's a little bit hotter down there. You don't get the winter like we do. Those operating costs really are influenced by what type of fan is chosen. So when you are designing a positive pressure hybrid system, I would compare different fan choices because not all 36-inch fans are created equal. They're all going to have differences in their efficiency and output, and that will have a significant role in that annual operating cost per cow. And then, of course, maintenance. Prioritize your investment. You've invested in these fans. You are turning on the switch and they're running, but to make sure that they are at their optimal performance and are providing your desired ventilation rate and air speeds, make sure they're cleaned. So at least put them on a biannual maintenance schedule, get them ready for the summer and clean, and then shut them down after the summer months. But depending on what research you read, you could lose anywhere from 20 to 50% of your fan capacity if they're not maintained. So if you're running a ventilation system with 100 fans, that could potentially mean that you haven't been maintaining. That could potentially mean that you're only running 50 of those fans. So definitely maintain your system. One thing I like to point out with ventilation systems is that, once they are installed, it's really important to go back and make sure that they are operating like you want and make sure that we are getting our fast moving air in the resting space. So the tools that I like to use are propane foggers. They are really great at illustrating how air is moving through the barn, and then going out with an anemometer and measuring air speeds in the stall resting space. And you can also put up little temperature and relative humidity monitors in the pen so that you are capturing what the cow microenvironment is versus the overall barn. But when I go out to barns, I will take a range of airspeed measurements between 3 fans in line and take measurements every 8 feet or every other stall to try and characterize the fast moving air in the cow resting space with a goal of having 90% of those measurements be above 200 feet per minute. And so we had the opportunity to go out to one of these farms with a positive pressure tube system or positive pressure hybrid system installed. And take measurements in a section of one of the head-to-head rows of stalls where we were more towards the middle of the barn so that we didn't have any influence from prevailing winds, and we could really focus on getting the measurements from the fans. And so you can see here in the video that I'm playing that, that air is coming in from that fan, and it's somewhat getting down into the head-to-head row of stalls. And so visually we can see that it might not be working the way that we quite want. And so we went back and took airspeed measurements at cow resting height. And what we did not get 90% of the stalls with airspeeds of 200 feet per minute or more. We only got a small area on the row of stalls closest to the feed bunk. So by going back and taking those airspeed measurements, we realized that the angle of those fans wasn't enough to get the bank of stalls closest to the fans. It was only getting the second row there. So really important to make sure that when these fans are being installed, that you are getting the appropriate angle. So I'd recommend putting a few fans up, going in with an anemometer, making sure that you're getting that 200 to 400 feet per minute in both rows of the head-to-head stall before, putting them all up at the desired angle. And just to illustrate that point of it's really these systems, these positive pressure systems really only work for head-to-head stalls is because, as you can see on the screen here, as air is moving through that fan, it's going to travel about 20 feet before it hits the cow environment. So you have a bunch of dead space directly under the fan. So if there was a stall directly under the fan, in this case, those animals wouldn't be getting of the air. You'd have to, push them to the middle rows of stalls. So really be cognizant of that, because you think, oh, I put a fan up, it's covering this entire space. Not necessarily, it's only getting a little section. I know we're kind of running out of time, so just a couple things I wanted to point out, because when you hear positive pressure, you may think of positive pressure tube systems, which are mostly seen in calf barns, but have been installed in some adult cow facilities where maybe they're very compromised in terms of natural ventilation. There's barns nearby blocking airflow into the barn, or they're in a really old facility where you can't open up the sidewalls to get fresh air. So the idea of the positive pressure tube system is that you have a fan located directly on an end wall, bringing in fresh air into a tube system that then has air jets directed over the cow stalls to provide the 200 to 400 feet per minute. And it can be done. However, we're often limited to how long the pen is. So we can cover anywhere from 100 to 150 foot long pens, but it's really hard to do more than that without running the tubes back to back. And then obviously there's height restrictions. You want them out of the way of cows licking on them or equipment when you're doing bedding. So it's not my number one go-to. It's very much unique in adult cow barns that have some challenges for hanging fans, or going to a mechanical system, or opening up those sidewalls. So And then obviously we've very much heard about positive pressure tube systems in calf barns, where the primary goal is to provide a minimum year-round ventilation rate of 4 air changes per hour without drafting the calves. But now there has been a lot more interest in heat abatement for calves as well. And so we're seeing some interest in designing tube systems that will provide an increased ventilation rate, but also create fast moving air in the calf microenvironment. And so one of the limitations with tubes for both calves and adult cows is that we are limited on how many more air exchanges these systems can provide. So our goal again is at 40 to 60 air changes per hour, but in order to get that with tube systems, we would have to fill the entire ceiling with tubes, which is just impractical and not recommended. So there is some leeway in that the tubes are more about providing fast moving air and bringing in some extra fresh air, but it's not going to get us to the level that we are prioritizing versus with our mechanical systems, such as the positive pressure hybrid barn, we can add more fans to get us to the higher exchange rates that we're looking for. So here's just an example of one of those barns that has put in both a winter system as well as a summer system. And then lastly, our group in biological systems engineering under the direction of Dr. Chris Choi is looking at a positive pressure plenum. So it kind of looks like a tube, but it's more of a box with nozzles that are directing airflow down into the stalls and giving cows the fresh air as well as increased air speeds. And so the idea with this system is having to use less fans to ventilate the space. And so this just got installed this past summer, and I have not heard the results of the system yet. But who knows, maybe we'll see something in the coming months about positive pressure plenum systems. So to go back to the very beginning of the slides, just again, focus on providing air exchange throughout the year, both in the winter and the summer, and then prioritizing fast moving air in the cow resting space and make sure that the system is cost effective. So if you are considering a positive pressure system, it's definitely a viable option. It will just be dependent very much on your current facilities. And, if you have a 2-row head-to-head pen, then I would definitely be an advocate for looking at positive pressure as a possible solution for improving ventilation and heat abatement in your barn. But if you're in a 6-row barn or are considering building a much wider barn, then I would recommend looking at the mechanical ventilation negative pressure systems of cross or tunnel. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that may have come in.
So, Courtney, I know when we were just talking about the positive pressure type of barns, that it is a little bit more of a case by case. And is it the scenario that best fits for what you already have if you're looking to renovate or even building? Is it the best case for what's around? Are there certain folks or certain resources that a person would be able to look at or look to be able to know if this would be a scenario that works for them and truly works for them in the long run?
Yeah, so the idea originally started by Dr. Gordy Jones, and he offers some consulting services, I believe. So he would be somebody that could talk more about the feasibility of building that type of barn. And then a lot of the fan manufacturers have included that in their portfolio of ventilation design. So I highly recommend working with local dealers to talk about your ventilation needs, get some ideas of what nearby facilities have been doing, and then going and visiting those barns, asking the questions of, what do you think of the system? What would you have done differently? How do you operate it? Are there any improvements that you would make? Just so you get an idea to see if that is the environment you would like to work in and provide for your animals. And then, of course, the Dairyland Initiative also has resources on our website about the different types of ventilation systems that you can cross-reference to.
I have to say, there is no best resource, I think, some days, well, some days, than producer to producer. But in this situation, it definitely is, being able to see something in person, ask those
Yeah.
questions, and really get the real feel of it can make a big difference. Courtney, not to be negative on here, or too negative, I guess. Some days people think I might just ask these questions all the time. But in general, though, when it comes to ventilation, what's kind of, that biggest pitfall you see with folks? Or I guess maybe we could flip it. What is the biggest area of opportunity? I'm going to be positive on here.
Wow, that is I love
Energy.
how you spun that question, Amber. That was great. I gotta do that more myself. So the biggest area for improvement is checking once the system is in if you are getting air speeds. I've been in way too many facilities where when you are standing in the center feet lane and looking at panel fans that have been installed over a row of stalls, they look good, but when you actually get in there with an anemometer to measure air speeds, you find that in reality, spacing between the fans is too much, or they weren't angled properly. So really do more than just a visual observation, actually get it down dirty and take measurements in the stalls. And that will make a huge improvement in any ventilation system.
And this probably goes hand in hand with that last question. And maybe even it is the same answer. But when you're thinking about, or when folks come to you guys and say, gosh, I am just having a struggle with my ventilation. I mean, what is that first place that you would recommend folks look at?
So whenever I'm called out to a facility to evaluate the ventilation system, I am first getting the dimensions of the barn so I can figure out what the volume is, and then looking at how much fan capacity is needed to provide our desired ventilation rates, and then comparing that to what has been installed. So usually you can go back to the original quotes and see what types of fans were installed to figure out how much capacity they're providing. And then sometimes maybe there is enough fan capacity, but the inlet isn't sized appropriately. So you're not getting enough air coming in. It's not mixing well. And so you might have these dead pockets. So also taking measurements of the air of the inlet and making sure that inlet air speeds are anywhere from 500 to 800 feet per minute to ensure good mixing of air. So I always start with making sure that we have enough fan capacity for the volume of the barn to get our desired air exchange rate, and then move to looking at air speeds in the resting space.
What I have to say when it comes to ventilation, and I feel like it's no matter what the barn type is, how it's built, there's a lot of those similar answers in terms of there's things you can do on your farm to make sure that if you're not happy or and you know that there's something with the ventilation, you can start there first. But also, there's a lot of people, especially nowadays, I feel like in the past few years, it's become a lot more popular to have the discussions around ventilation and good quality ventilation. So that like you were just saying, Courtney, you can have folks who come in and know what they're looking for. So that's a lot of really good information to be thinking about, especially if you're in ventilation at all. But when you're thinking about something like a positive pressure barn? And is this an actual solution for maybe something I've been struggling with? So, with all that being said, though, today, Courtney, as we're wrapping up here, what's kind of that one key takeaway or maybe a drive home message you want producers to be thinking about or actively doing from today's discussion?
So the big takeaway here is to make sure that we are ventilating the barn space to make sure that we are removing heat, gases, bacteria, and moisture from the barn. That this works well across all seasons. And then lastly, to make sure that no matter what type of ventilation system you've installed, that you're also optimizing the environment in the cow microenvironment and giving her those fast moving air speeds of 200 to 400 feet per minute. And then, of course, making sure that the system is cost effective and meets your needs in terms of your willingness to maintain fans.
Well, Courtney, thank you so much for your time here this afternoon. It's much appreciated, especially as this is our last episode before we're on like a holiday break here. So I think it was a great way to conclude our 2025 here on the Dairy Signal. So thank you so much for your time here this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Amber, and happy 2026 to everyone.
Yes, yeah, it is crazy to think we are almost there.
Yeah.
With that being said, like I was just saying, we have actually 2 weeks off here on the Dairy Signal, just with the way the holidays wind up this year. We're giving you guys a couple of weeks of break, but that doesn't mean you can't get some great episodes of the Dairy Signal by going back and searching. It's pretty easy within the system to find something that fits you and the needs that you're looking for. So whether it's ventilation, whether it's market updates, whether it's anything in between, we've got an episode on there for you. I also have to say that with 2026 around the corner, there's a lot of great programs coming up in the world of professional dairy producers. We have our Managers Academy. So if you are looking to get out of this weird weather we are having, whether that be rainy, cold, or just somewhere in between, you can head to Puerto Rico with us for Managers Academy for Dairy Professionals. That is at the end of January. But another date to be keeping in mind is if you are looking to apply for Cornerstone, that date is January 15th. So get those applications in if Cornerstone is on your list and on your radar for this next year. But with that, I wish you all a happy holidays and we'll see you here in 2026. Bye now.